This is the final word, and we're very pleased to welcome back to the show Adrian Brown. It's been a minute since your last documentary series came out. This one, the new series that's just been released. We've been talking about having babies on the final word. This is maybe a little bit like that feeling of seeing it take its first steps out into the world. How does it feel this time around?
Yeah, it does. It's funny having gone through it a second time, I suppose, having the first sort of series released a couple of years ago now, that maybe not as much fear, I think, as the initial series that released, but at the same point, fear for different reasons, given the expectation of how well I think the first series was received, or just how different it was first time around, that people were suddenly, oh, wow, we get to see behind the closed doors of, the Australian cricket team. Whereas this, I think the expectation was there because of the first series. What are we going to see, and what's going to unfold of, the issues and everything else that happened over these series.
Like, you've got less of a surprise factor in terms of being right in there.
Absolutely. I think so, because you couldn't just rely on these images, which almost stood for themselves the first time around, and go, oh, wow, Aaron Finch walking back into the change rooms after being dismissed. That's just a scene on itself. It's like, never seen that before, haven't seen this before. It's like, yeah, well, that's been done. What else do we have? And then also, we did actually have, we knew going in that this was very much about, okay, the focus on the players. So we weren't sitting over the shoulder of Justin Langer through the games or Andrew McDonald at a later stage. We very much were trying to see, hey, what were the players up to, moving around in that sense. So we almost didn't have that, I guess, ability to have that narrator constantly, flow us through the games, and then see that in real time in docs footage as well.
It's something that you notice with sequels a lot of the time. Sometimes they kill off a main character from the original, or they move them to the background in order to create some space to do something different. You wouldn't have known at the start of the process that Langer wasn't going to be there at the end of the process. And the first series was built around him so much. But was that an opportunity that gave you some space to do something different? It created the need to do something different?
I think so. And even probably just coming in for the second time, you're always looking to maybe do, we couldn't just say, well, let's just paint and color what we did last time and we're going to talk through this series, because you never know how series one will play out. Maybe the Ashes series would have hopefully been a bit closer for dramatic effect, for, to lean into the story of the games a little bit more. But we certainly did just know what we didn't do in series one was spend a bit more time with players away from the game, or tell a story like Glenn Maxwell, who didn't make the final team, and to be able to spend a bit more time in those moments was something that we were excited about, and going in that we knew. And let's stick to that.
For an audience of this podcast, that Glenn Maxwell story is a real heartbreaker. In the last episode, you get this emotional rawness and this proximity, this very transparent honesty. I mean, are you surprised that you're able to get players to be that open about how they're feeling about things?
I think so. I think so in a sense, but I don't know, maybe there's something to it that I'm sure you guys find. Anytime you actually really have the time to interview someone and really talk to them, and you're interested in their story, most people are sort of happy to talk and give. If you go beyond, the impact and the results and everything else, it's like, no, we want to know about you and the real core and how you are and what makes you tick, and you focus in on them. Usually people will give something back, I think. So, but in saying that, in Glenn went, beyond what we thought he would. And as soon as we saw it, even from the very first cut we put together, we thought, oh, we've got something pretty powerful here. And it was amazing to see Glenn like that. And then what was also great was like being able to say, no, we need to carve the time out in that 45 minutes to really sit with this for a while. And then another story might have to drop out of the way to make time for Glenn's story.
Yeah, it's interesting how you go about those editorial calls. Something like the Hobart Ashes test gets about 20 seconds because, well, that's about how long the match actually went. And then, there's 15 minutes on a Travis Head fitness test. It's interesting in that at the start of making it, you wouldn't think that that's how you would prioritize those things, but the way the search for story, it seems, drives that for you.
Exactly. And that's probably the hardest part. And I think even on the flip side of that is, even say for Travis Head, player of the series in the Ashes last year, that you go, oh, did we spend enough time with Travis through his moments? And there's the nice piece at the start with Alex Carey, and there's a bit at the Gabba with his first 100, which sort of sets the tone for Travis as he is now. But and also helps tell that story of the team playing freely and unleashed a little bit. But I guess that's also that point of difference to go, well, it's not a highlights vehicle per se that people can click on and go, well, there's the story of the match. What's other stories going on beneath that? Whether that's I always hark back to Glenn Maxwell. A lot of people have asked, oh, how come you've never really followed the players that were out of the team? And one of the reasons was that, and maybe we could do it even more so in Sri Lanka, is because the touring party is together. Sometimes they might move off and go back to their respective states or other things that you don't get the opportunity to follow that story through.
And I mean, your ability to roll with the punches, as it were, like, I can't imagine that at the start of that Ashes series, you would have anticipated you'd be making a whole episode on Scott Boland and Usman Khawaja.
No.
And yet that's the way it pans out.
Yeah, which is amazing, isn't it? Like it truly is in that sense. Even at the point, it's like, well, what the Melbourne 3 days? It's like, okay, well, what do we have here? And then, just expanding that out and sitting with it more. And then I remember when Usman scored that first 100, it's like, oh, there's a great story. But then the beauty of being able to come back in the second innings and make another 100, and the way the stories are told, that first 100 is a certain perspective on Usman, having the opportunity and taking it. And then the second one is almost, mirrors this, perspective on life that Usman has told through that second 100.
And something like, we've mentioned on this show before, the Welcome to Country at the Boxing Day Test, where Artie Joy Wanda Murphy mentioned Scott Boland by name, the crowd goes up. I mean, is that a sort of moment at the time watching it? Do you pick that and think, well, there's something that could be something? Or I mean, I suppose it comes into context with what happens in the game as well.
And that's almost the beauty of the series of making these, that you never know what comes into context given the events that might unfold, whether it's a day later or a week later or a couple of months later, that, in sort of putting this together, I don't know how back in, previous generations when you were cutting film, and splicing it together and go, there's your edit, and you want to unpack it, you've got to go back and unravel. The beauty of the editing systems now is that you almost have, we call them like little edit pods, where you'll cut a meeting down or, a match down to these specific 10 moments. 3 might only make the next pass because they have to tick off. They go, well, why does it, get to the next stage, or it needs a resolution later on? Some never resolve themselves, some don't quite go anywhere, and some are just too hard to work in with the flow and the narrative. So you're constantly dropping scenes, adding scenes, all that sort of thing.
So how does it work, the mechanics of this? Because you've got Doc in there.
I've just got a little visitor.
That's all right. It's always good to have a visitor now and again. We're happy to have a few extra guests on the show.
Yeah, there you go. You be quiet. Can listen.
So you've got Doc in there shooting every day, pretty much. What kind of volume of footage are you working with, and how do you? I mean, it must be a mountain to begin with. How do you start that process of whittling it down?
It is. One thing that it was probably the thing we learned most from that first series is just watch every frame, because you think you might be able to shortcut and go, well, let's just focus in day 3 and day 2 and focus in on these stories. But without watching absolute every frame, you just miss. I think some of my famous moments, my favorite moments within the series are just like, it might just be a visual moment and just a shot. And that might say as much about somebody's character or anything in the dressing room as, the spoken word through an interview. So they're really important things. And how many hours, I haven't done quite the calculation, but even say the broadcast footage in itself, important almost watching every frame, because you're looking for that one soundbite that we don't use any narration. We haven't sort of, I guess, built any narration through this series. It's all done through the interviews that we conduct. And hopefully you're finding a linking grab from an interview, and then equally with the broadcast footage by watching every day and again pulling all these clips out, you're just looking for that moment where a commentator just sets up how important this next 10 minutes is. on the
Yeah.
evening of day 3 Melbourne. Like they're the critical moments. You go, oh, I found it.
Yeah, so often it's the commentary grab that does that job for you, that gives the match position and that sort of thing. And yeah, the small moments I notice, something about how quietly and awkwardly Scott Boland sits there when he first comes into the dressing room, or the difference between, the way that Cameron Green comes in after he's got out and sits down quietly by himself versus Travis Head launching a bat across the dressing room. There's such contrast in the characters, in just the observations that aren't spoken about.
Yeah, it is. And I find myself, having rewatched it, we've watched it a number of times, you always pick up something a little bit different, whether that's depending on who's sitting where in a meeting, or, how players will talk to each other or let each other come into conversations and other things, that there's always just an extra little bit of focus that you'll find.
When you're going through that stuff, I mean, what...
Oh, Jeff, hold on a sec.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, yeah.
That's all right. No, it's all good. I'm quite used to this recording with Adam. There's a 2.5-year-old and a wandering around most of the time anyway.
Yes.
So what's your technique for trying to work out what grabs you? I mean, there are the small intimacies, and I think those are the things that really interest people, like something like the Night Watchman conversation when Lyon and Nisa are sitting there talking about who's going in next, and it gives you more of an insight in a way. I mean, does Doc get on the phone at the end of the day and say, I've got something really good from today, or is it up to you to try to tag those moments?
So sometimes it's sometimes driven, because you could never predict that. So the beauty of Doc, of just knowing, hey, that's happening, that's being aware. And maybe that was the beauty also of, that's a perfect example of stepping away from inside the specific coach's box and going, hey, what are the players up to? If not for that, we probably would have been in the coach's box at that point in that evening, but looking for where the players are going to. And then Doc, I think, once he knows he's in a good team, he can just sort of sit within it. The interesting part that possibly we always have is some of these scenes could probably either run a bit longer, but then you're also concerned about time and overall the flow of the episode, because you never want to be too long in a scene that people are starting to go, okay, I've seen enough for this, what's next? So there's a really fine balance between being there long enough and letting it, okay, we've got to move on and get to the next moment, because you want a certain amount of pace within these episodes that 45 minutes moves through quick, but equally so, sometimes you just want to sit in the moment.
Is that why you brought it down to 4 episodes this time around, half as many as the first time?
I think, not really. It's funny because I've always been, like, say you had an amazing Ashes series with 5 tests. As you say, we showed 20 seconds of Hobart. That was one. If that was a great test match, might have gone longer. You could, you might be able to extrapolate just one Ash series out to 4 episodes. But I've always been pretty strong on, rather than going, oh, we've got to make it 4 and just fill. Hopefully, it can run what it's worth. The interesting one on that is, you think the Sydney test, the end of the Sydney test in the Ashes, was a really great finish, really dramatic finish. But it felt like this strange moment in the story we're telling. Go, hey, we've just told the viewers the Ashes have just been won 3-zip. But we've told Usman's story to then build up to this dramatic crescendo of, what's going to happen on the 5th day of the Sydney test. I don't know if that would have been confusing for viewers to sort of take in and go, well, hang on, you've just told me that Ashes is over.
Yeah. And there's very little England in that Ashes story, because it's all about the personalities in that Australian team. And so in a way, focusing on the draw is focusing on the opposition, which, you don't do. I mean, I noticed a similar thing in Pakistan in the draw in Karachi. There's the focus on Babar Azam. The focus isn't on Mohammad Rizwan, who comes out and makes an incredible 100 in the last session. But in a way, you can't tell too many stories at the same time.
That I think is the hardest part. You just can't fit everything in. And at the end of, the edit, it just needs to be a story that viewers, for the first time, they can watch and go, you've given me enough to follow the story without overloading me to go, hang on, I can't connect all the dots. And so I can't connect to the story.
Were there things you learned from the first time around that you were able to do better this time?
certainly being at peace without trying to control it so much, like it just going, hey, whatever happens, it'll unfold. I think it was certainly a challenge in not having sort of, Justin Langer, like a bit being there present to really lean in on the coaches. I think in that first series, by following the coaches quite closely, that they always worked as this, timestamp, here where we are, here's the build up to the next test, here's the plans, here's everything else. That was a harder challenge, I think, going in, of how we connect the flow. And I think probably just working out, because we didn't have this challenge in the first episode, when we go to these backstories, as we call them, whether that's, Alex Carey, Travis Head, Nathan Lyon, and these stories away from the game, where do they drop in? Where's the moment to jump out of the match vision, jump out of the test match, leave, and hopefully join back in? They were probably a challenge that we just sort of, we were constantly moving those to go, maybe that fits here, maybe that fits here. Needs to be close enough to a performance again in a match that there's sort of some resolution to that moment, or you're introducing this character, that where's the payoff going to be?
It's interesting that because you get an Ashes without much competitive tension, you do get to lean into the storytelling more. It's interesting to me that you've got a point maybe in Australian cricket where there's some sort of reckoning about race and Australian cricket's poor history on race, and then the way that Ashes series works out, the stories are about an Aboriginal player and a Muslim player, and that's not forced. That's just the way that the most compelling stories of that series worked out. Is there a sense of satisfaction in getting to tell stories that matter beyond just talking about the cricket?
Definitely. I think definitely. And stepping away from it, because even in that sense, when those moments happen, you're like, wow, they were the talk of the news cycle. Everyone spoke about Scotty Boland, everyone spoke about Usman Khawaja. And then maybe there's this sense in time that you go, not how do we tell these different, but people already know these stories. People know Scotty Boland's performance. How can we either go a little bit deeper? How can we find more meaning in it? How can we, I guess, keep that story and tell it either in a different manner, or somehow hopefully tell the whole story of it, or give it a greater sense of purpose. And it feels like, in a sense, that it has done that. And it's nice, I think, for it to be a marker of a moment of, people can look back and go, I sort of, maybe I didn't get all the full picture in that story. And I think certainly with the Scott Boland, with some examples he spoke about there, and even Usman, it's been great reading, I think, some of the follow-up feedback to those stories. I think that's been really powerful.
And something like, the way that Boland was so shy in every interview that he did during that week, this was the first time when I heard him open up a bit more about it and actually be able to respond in a fuller kind of way, maybe because he'd been able to talk for long enough and get comfortable enough to express himself, rather than just say, it's nice to be here, and I feel a bit embarrassed at all the attention.
I think so. And time is like wonderful in that sense, that time even gives us all context to reflect and to go, okay, I've gathered my thoughts, and maybe for Scott, no, it really did happen. He's never going to change from how humble Scott Boland is, but he can, I think, now in distance, appreciate how amazing it was and how amazing an experience it was. And I even, you talk about little moments, the shot of Scott Boland walking off, even with his daughter, and carrying a teddy bear just at the end in an empty MCG, was, that equally speaks to all parts Scott Boland as everything else that happened.
Yeah. I mean, the most words that he said out there probably in the middle were, you've left monkey behind, which is a great moment. And I wonder what it's like for you as well, having sifted through all the footage from the first one, then the second one. You spent so much time with some of these characters, and you watch character development happen in real time. Someone like Steve Smith in this series, who seems so much happier now. Now that he's not captain, he seems much more relaxed. He does his thing. He's able to have his eccentricities and, fix all of his 83 pairs of gloves and to be himself. But he seems, he comes across as a more relaxed person in this. Do you get to track those actual changes within personalities?
I do. I think the most fascinating one, and I actually heard him talk about it in a soundbite off the launch. And Marnus Labuschagne spoke about how he hadn't played too many test matches without the Amazon crew, and across these series goes from Marnus making his debut in Dubai, getting recalled for a Sydney test match, and then the Lord's test match, and seeing Marnus at all points along the way. To where he is now and the confidence he has within the change room and he's standing in the game, I find him a fascinating study. And even Travis Head, further to that too, and they both debuted in that Dubai Test match really early on, and both in that first innings didn't have the greatest performance, but to look where they are now, and I find that, and I haven't done one day, it would be amazing to hear and find the audio and somehow listen back to those original interviews that we did and to hear what their perspective on cricket was like then.
Yeah. I mean, so often, particularly early in a career, you get a very stunted version of a person because a cricketer's pushed in front of a camera and told to talk to it, and they're not used to doing that. They don't want to do that. That's not why they play the game.
Yeah. I think those have been, those personal stories also that's been most interesting to follow. I'm interested, what were your perspectives of watching Series 2 to Series 1 and the change? Was it what you thought it was going to be? Was it a different series from Series 1?
Well, I mean, I was surprised that it was shorter because I just assumed that the nature of a streaming platform would be max content. Let's just have as much as possible. So in a way, that spoke to good editorial judgment to say, well, we're just going to use what we've got. We're going to make it the most compelling version rather than try to fill out a certain number of episodes. But yeah, the character study side of it, that is what has changed. I mean, there are those moments in season 1, you're suddenly driving around with Aaron Finch in his car, driving from the game to go home, and sit on the couch. And that was surprising. That was a jump. But I suppose, I mean, how do you balance? Because I've been hearing this from people in England watching this, saying that they resent this documentary because it makes them like Australian players, and they're like, I shouldn't have to like Australian cricketers. That's not reasonable. But I mean, you're balancing between wanting to do something real and credible, and not wanting to do a puff piece, like to do PR for the Australian cricket team. Where does that sit? How do you try to strike that balance?
Yeah, it's funny that, because look, you can't do it without the help of Cricket Australia now, with the help of the team. We're embedded within them. So you're mindful of that. But there's sort of never at any point to say, oh, we really need to put more of this player in and over X. We need to build up the profile here, there. We were very, we were given complete creative control to tell the story as we saw it. There's a leadership, I guess, committee, that was sent back, early edits, just to make sure, because you still want to be fair. There's still maybe a conversation or something that was filmed that you shouldn't be filmed, and that's just, fair and reasonable. And I probably always put myself in that situation that somebody asked me to, hey, can I film your work for a year? So you go about it. Of course, you'd want to be able to work with them and say, okay, well, I don't even know if I'd be open to that, but if I was, can I just have a sense of, say, hey, here's some context to these moments, or here's why I feel uncomfortable about that. But there really wasn't that much at all to be concerned about. I think the core part might just be getting down and speaking to the Glenn Maxwell example of just, I think people truly do like people either being vulnerable, authentic's a term that's used a lot now. I think people just appreciate that, and there are points you cannot in any way fabricate the dressing room. Like Doc can, no way, we never ask anyone to reshoot, stand in a better position for light, do anything else. What is truly happening on game day, whether that's the players preparing themselves, Marnus with his toasty, David Warner doing the laundry, you're never going to sit there and go, hey, this would be a great scene. Can you pick up all the socks and everything else, do that, and then say to X player, okay, has anyone got any whites? You're not going to.
Yeah, I mean, that was the two most surprising bits of the show for me. David Warner caring about not putting dark socks in with the whites, and Marnus Labuschagne putting a cheese toastie in the fridge. I mean, that's a crime against humanity. That shouldn't be happening. But it was interesting as well that you've got those little moments. And you asked about the first season, and I think this is one that so many people came to. Like Usman Khawaja's not a big part of the first season, really. But his exchange with Justin Langer is one of the most compelling scenes. He is the star of the second season, really. He's the one who, and it's not just in the Sydney episode, because then you go to Pakistan, he's really taking this leadership role off the field as well, being the kind of cultural bridge and all of the rest of it. That's an interesting development that he has, that he'd grown in confidence so much, because the way, I mean, I've been covering cricket most of his career, and probably 10 years ago, he was a pretty quiet, often fairly chippy sort of character. And it's like he's blossomed in this way later into his career.
Yeah. It's interesting that too, because we certainly thought at a point, well, Usman's had this great Sydney test. We've spent a lot of time with him. Episode 3, we're back in Pakistan, and we're sort of, there's a lot of Usman in here, but how could it not be to make a century back, in the town where his father was? Like, how can you not lean into that again? Hopefully you're telling a different side of the story, which I think we have. That episode 2 is very much about Usman the individual, and then it's that broader part of his family and his father and that connection to cricket. Yeah, I still remember the first time I think I interviewed Usman, and it was off the back of the Dubai tests. Remember, he made that 100 to draw to save the game. And not to say he's different, because he's always been open and honest and will tell you everything there is. I think he's almost more, I don't know, I don't want to speak for Usman, but maybe more comfortable within himself where he sits, because within, and he's spoken about his sort of standing within the Australian team. I think maybe for earlier points that he felt this way or that way, or maybe pushed down a little bit, or not be able to fully express himself. Now he's got a complete confidence to go, no, I'm completely comfortable with expressing myself. And he's just a joy to interview, a joy to talk to, a joy to throw any question to. He's fantastic.
And it must be a relief. I mean, I imagine some of the interviews are less rich with possibility, I'll put it that way.
Yeah, it is. And that's also a process in itself, because you never interview everyone at the same time, at the same day, that invariably you'll find a little bit of a moment that you'll want to circle back. And so we did 3 rounds of interviews with the players, that you'd do an early one, then you'd find information from that interview session, you'd come back for you, say, we need to find the response to this moment. And you just sort of keep on adding that process. But equally is the charm, which equally is, I think, also within that episode too, is the difference between Scott Boland. I think why it sort of balances out so well, because you've got Usman, who's, quite comfortable in front of the camera, versus shy Scott Boland, who's, a little bit more reserved. So it balances out quite well.
Where does it go? Does this roll on into a franchise? Do you get poached like a coach to go and work for the IPL, do the Royal Challengers Bangalore documentary?
That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Yeah, I don't know. I'm interested, because there is that point, and I think I probably felt this even after the first series, and there was the thought, okay, do we do 2? It's like, haven't we done cricket? How do you do it? But you see it with other franchises, other sport franchises, that they sort of roll on, and maybe it assists by you coming back, that you are invested in these characters. I want to see what happens to, because what we sort of haven't told, in a sense, is, a player at the twilight of their career. How does that unfold when the body can't do what the mind wants it to?
Yeah.
Those challenges, I think, would be interesting.
Or what happens afterwards? What happens when they're done? Because I think that's one of the little told stories is you get players when they've kind of figured out how to exist in retirement a couple of years later, but that immediate period of time is so difficult for so many.
Yeah, exactly. Which would be, I've always been amazed by that for any athlete, in that sense of, okay, that first part of life has ceased to exist as it once was, that it's like, okay, how do you deal with that and move on? But I don't know. What is certainly interesting about this team is there is this element that it could be one of the great teams, you know, and the calendar that's coming is an amazing, you know, next 6 months of cricket. I've read a lot of feedback, and it was unfortunate because I think people felt, oh, you weren't filming the Border-Gavaskar Trophy of what, 2021, I think, is that right?
Yeah.
And truly because of COVID at that time, it made it impossible to do it. I would have loved to have, because that would have been just an amazing series of film. That would have been absolutely dramatic. And so I think people felt like, oh, we opted not to put it in because it might have shown Australia bad. Like, no, that would have been unbelievable to witness from the inside, and then to carry on further. But it wasn't to be. You know, I think Doc was literally able to get into to Brisbane, you know, a week before you know, the first test for the Ashes.
Yeah. I mean, you forget how close to the wire it was in some ways to even get this one done.
Absolutely. So, you know, hopefully there's more. I'd be interested to see whether, you know, there's the other cricketing nations pick it up and what they might do. But yeah, we're certainly, you know, if the Australian team's happy to have us, we're certainly on board.
Well, England will do it, but they'll do like 8-minute episodes. They'll do it even faster. You know, they've got to outstrip everybody at this point. It's out in the world. It's the second series of the test. Adrian Brown, congratulations.
Cheers, Jeff. Thanks for having me.